Welcome to Gatorcast, the official podcast of Green River College, where we share conversations with the community about topics that are relevant to you. I'm Suzanne Johnson, president of the college. My guest today is Dr. Kathy Obear, co-founder of the Social Justice Training Institute. This is part 2 of my conversation with Kathy exploring equity at community colleges. If you didn't get a chance to listen to part 1, I encourage you to hop off and listen to that. But if not, enjoy the podcast today. Have a great day. One of the things I'm wondering about, taking it just a step away from specifically community colleges, is something that came to mind as you were talking about your own life journey, your own life experience, growing up in a white middle class, fairly naive, sheltered. I'm using the sheltered word. You did not use the sheltered word, but you used okay. Life experience in the 60s, of which I can absolutely relate to and identify with. And then going to, private higher education, right? Private liberal arts college, coming from a family where I was able to do that and then go on to get a master's and PhD, and then becoming a faculty member at a predominantly white institution that was serving predominantly white students from very similar backgrounds to mine. And the different experiences I had in terms of understanding diversity of learning. You've spoken a lot about student learning differences today in our conversation. And, wondering about the student experience and my experience in the classroom. And I just recall, and I went into faculty ranks in the late 1980s, and I recall having come from a background where going to college was not only a privilege, but a time period where you could have fun, explore ideas, take classes. Okay, yes, you might have had a major, but the idea that you were going to college to get a good job and a career really wasn't part of the narrative of my experience and my classmates' experiences. Although if you had asked us all, why were we going to college, we would have all said, well, because you have to if you want to have a career, right? But then within the classroom, when I was a faculty member, I started running up against a very different perspective that I had had the privilege of not thinking about, which was the predominant answer I would get from students in my classrooms, like, why were you taking this class? I need it for the major because I'm going to be that, right? They were absolutely seeing that their education was a means to an end. And it took me a long time to recognize that my perspective was one about the value of education and what the role of a college education might be, was absolutely based on a lot of my own life experience and privilege. Not that it's not an important set of experiences, and I want all learners to be able to have that experience, learning for the sake of learning and so on. But I came to recognize that a lot of my view of higher education had a lot to do with the privileged background I came from. And I see that that's something that is oftentimes a conversation in community colleges as well. It's like, what is the role and the value of education? What is the purpose of a college education? And, is it for a career, or is it for personal enrichment and learning for the sake of learning? And I think it's so important to leave the or, let go of the or. It's the and. It's the and, right? But that whole preamble to lead up to this question, is there something about those of us who go into higher education, or is there something about higher education as a system that presents its own obstacles to creating learning environments that produce equitable outcomes?
I'm loving this. You're having me think. as I was listening to you, the classism in that, the class privilege, which is so related to white skin privilege, for me to be able to say, because I so relate to everything you said, higher ed and college should be about love of learning and learning to be a lifelong learner without a focus on career development, I think is arrogant and only can apply to folks who may have a safety net so that when they leave, they can easily find a job, whether that's because of nepotism or a relationship or connections, et cetera. So there's a real class gender, I think, privileged white men particularly, but also white women. So that's my first thought. I actually think four-year schools could learn a lot from community colleges about being career ready. And it's not an either or, as you said. So how do we have people learn about lifelong learning? Because in our lifetimes, well, tell me if you agree, I grew up believing that if I just got with one organization, I could move up as far as I wanted to if I was just working hard, and I could be a leader of it someday. I watched people start out, in a General Motors and then move up and be there their entire 40-year career. So that was the U.S. that was presented to me. And it's been a long time since that, I think, it may never have been true for some groups, and it clearly is rarely true for anyone today. And so helping our staff and faculty and leaders realize that actually probably the best thing we can do for folks is give them a portfolio of skills and competencies, critical thinking, perspective taking, the ability to learn, media literacy, financial literacy. Yes, content in an area they can then use and go out and get a job. But these portable career skills, emotional intelligence, how do you work on diverse teams? How do you deal with conflict? When I work with faculty, I really support them thinking about what's the content of the core you're teaching, English, chemistry, and how can you, as you're teaching, have students develop these critical skills that are going to help them reinvent themselves as the world demands that people probably reinvent themselves several times in their lifetimes, different careers, different types of jobs. So for me, it is a both and. And the kind of privileged traditional higher ed it's about lifelong, learning to love learning and that you can keep learning in and of itself, so privileged as opposed to how do you want to be of service in the world? So I actually expand it from a job, and I think that's what community colleges do as well. How do you want to give back and be of service to others? Lawyer, doctor, teacher, supervisor of Toyota manufacturing, running your own automobile shop. And what are the skills you're going to need today and tomorrow so that you can be successful and help other people be successful? So community colleges were set up to support folks in lifelong learning, enrichment, as well as technical skills, as well as, quote, academic skills. I think the rest of the country has a lot to learn from you all. I want to make one more point. My brother ended up going to a school where he came out with electrical engineering. It was kind of more of a technical. He works, if I remember accurately, fixing and running a shop that does all the AV for an entire school district, K-12, so that students can be learning. Right? Who's to say the role he has is any less or more important than the role I have in the world? And so part of this is to also have faculty and staff and leaders try to just really challenge all that classism about which jobs are more important and better that we reinforce in the society through finances, how much money you make as opposed to how are you being of service. Want everyone to have a really good income so they can live well and they feel that they're being of service and giving back in a way that meets their core values as well as leaves a legacy. For me, that's what I'd love higher ed to do and help people get those values as opposed to, I want to make $500,000 as a doctor, but why are you doing it?
So much of what you've described are so many reasons that I know staff and faculty here at Green River have chosen to be at Green River as a community college. It's certainly the reason I left private, four-year institutional higher ed culture to come into community colleges, and it is the the brilliance and the asset of the word "and," right? Community colleges, we absolutely have a multidimensional mission. We don't have although certainly student success is a single statement we can say we're invested in. That can look many different ways, right? As you just mapped out, whether it's career technical, transferring on to another institution and beyond for graduate degrees or what have you, continuing education, and so on. That's one of the beauties of, and I think, a collection of assets that make community colleges such a vibrant and necessary element of higher ed currently and, moving more into the future. And having said that, then, and knowing the work that we've done as an institution in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and so many other institutions like Green River that we're working on and toward and with in terms of improving these dimensions, so that students come to our college and feel that they belong no matter what the diversity is that they present. I'm thinking that in your years of experience, the many years of experience, you likely have some pretty sound advice or thoughts, or perspective that you can offer to the different constituencies that are part of what we call a community college as a culture. And I'm wondering, I'll throw out these questions and we could do them one by one, if you're game. What specific message would you have for people who are white that work at community colleges? What would you have as a specific message or messages for people of color who work at community college? What is the message that you would have for students who attend community college? Let's talk about those types of groups, and we can divide them in different ways. What sorts of messages would you have for faculty at Green River or other colleges similar to ours, or for the staff that are front-facing to our students? How would you like to approach this?
My message would be, what's your passion and your values around working here at a community college? So I'd have them play with that. But let me just start with whites. If I was working with a group of whites, I'd do that and then say, it's critical as whites that we understand that racism has existed in this country for centuries, and there's still very damaging manifestations today. And as whites, it's one thing to understand racism. It's another to every day have a racial justice lens as you're making decisions about how to interact with students, how to create a policy or a practice, how to build a curriculum in ways that create a racially just campus climate, classroom, and dismantle racist attitudes, behaviors, practices day to day. So it's not enough to not say something racist. How are you an active partner with folk of color, folk that are indigenous, folk that are multiracial, biracial, an active partner in creating true racial justice on this campus? And then my message would be, and if you're like me, we probably want to start internally, because I grew up hearing and unfortunately unconsciously believing many racist attitudes that I still stumble over today. And so the work that we have to do as whites internally to heal and release racist attitudes, beliefs that fuel behaviors that have a racist impact, that's our work as whites in whiteness affinity spaces as well as in cross-race conversations. At the same time, we want to be doing similar work around other areas of difference and oppression so we can create true inclusion and liberation. And given the U.S. context and the U.S. history, If we don't start with race and really center race in every conversation we have, not to the exclusion of others, but to make sure it's always on the table, then many of our students will not have the equitable services and classrooms and the skills they need here to succeed, much less when they leave here. The other thing I might say to whites is I did this work. As I said, I was trained as a K-12 teacher, and I was coming out of that I didn't know at the time, kind of patronizing deficit model of, let me help these poor students of color, which is a very different energy than I hope and I believe I have today. And so this is not about helping people of color who are in that deficit model. It's about how to create systems that are truly set up for success of all, as opposed to the implicit racist bias that's in many policies and practices, even in how we interact with people and the microaggressions. So, long way of saying that's the kind of workshops that I do with folk. I'm ready to move to folk of color unless you want to come in.
No, keep going. Good. We're good.
So the folks of color, folks that are indigenous, multiracial, biracial, and you'll notice that I pull that out and we could get even more specific in that sometimes when people hear the term people of color, whites particularly only hear Black. And indigenous peoples are so invisible in the U.S. That I am challenging myself to name indigenous peoples more and more. And my understanding of Green River is that you actually have a higher percentage of folks identify as indigenous than some other campuses I get to.
Yes, absolutely.
And then the invisibility of multiracial, biracial folks have a different life experience than monoracial people of color. So what I'd say is, what would I say as a white person? That I'm committed to working with whites and working with folk of color, indigenous, multiracial folk, to have authentic, engaged, sometimes challenging conversations to really be able to get everybody more skilled to recognize racist microaggressions, those comments and behaviors that in the moment interpersonally leave people of color feeling excluded, dismissed, not valued. To look at the policies and practices that were set up probably by white people for white people, but we weren't conscious of it necessarily, and how even today whites are saying and doing things and creating classrooms that are just not inclusive of folk of color, indigenous, multiracial folk. And so how do we, as folks of color, partner with whites to create a new system? And part of that, it's a little awkward saying this as a white person, I feel, but I might also say, is as whites, we need to do our inner healing work around internalized dominance, the internalized beliefs that whites are smarter, better, our way is the right way, the only way. How, whites speak and dress and act is what professional is, as opposed to there's actually many variations of what professional could be that are culturally inclusive. And as just one example, that folk of color, indigenous, multiracial, biracial folk might also have some healing work to do. Because in the same racist system, many folks of color, to survive, to support themselves, family, have colluded, absorbed those same messages that white is right. And so there's some inner healing work for folk of color as well. In the language of that, internalized racism is some of the jargon. So there's internalized dominance or internalized white supremacy, if folks can hear that language, for whites to work, and internalized racism, internalized subordination for folk of color. And how does a campus community or a community with your campus create spaces so that folks from the privileged and marginal identity can do that inner healing work so that we can come together, have very productive conversations about the current dynamics of race and racism interpersonally and in the climate and in the policies and practices. And then what can we do to undo all that and create truly inclusive organizations?
And if we looked at this in a different clustering of group memberships that we have on a college campus, what would be particular messages that you have for our faculty, those that find themselves in the classroom teaching our diverse student body?
Then I would, again, come back to your passion and what you want to create, why are you here instead of working someplace else? And are you willing to consider the possibility that there are a few other things you could be doing to truly creating classroom, advising, faculty interactions that accelerate student success for the full breadth of the students we serve and all their intersecting identities? Are you open to that? And then I would say, let's start with sharing what you're already doing. It's not only faculty, but folks with different privileged identities. I think it's useful to start with strengths. So what are you already doing, and have people learn from each other, and why are you doing it? And then what are some practices that you're beginning to wonder if they truly are as inclusive as they could be, whether it's by race or disability status or mental health status or class background, transportation status. So let's look at 20 generic common ways people teach at community colleges and advise, and let's begin to talk about whose needs are met by group membership, and are there any groups that may not have their needs met or have an unintended barrier, an artificial barrier to success. And so I'd have them talk about it in practice, but mostly share with each other, because I personally find faculty, and if you're listening, you might not agree, but I find faculty listen to each other more than they might than an administrator or a staff member. There's a hierarchical class dynamic on most campuses. So how can faculty teach each other? And so the message is, if you truly want to live up to your passion and the vision and the purpose of this campus, we have to be in continuous improvement. And there are so many new ways that people are teaching and engaging and advising that are happening all the time. So how can we research those and then see how many of those might work in our context and in your particular context? So we're modeling continuous lifelong learning for our students. We're doing it as faculty. Another conversation I might have is I'd have them take the group identity cards. Remember, that's like 37 different categories of difference. And I say, so when you started teaching, what were the differences of our students? And today, are there any other differences that you're seeing more and more of? So that they get grounded in how all these different intersecting identities and who are we truly serving? And then say, when you started teaching, whose needs were met by the way you taught, and how have you changed your teaching practices to reflect the shifting needs of how people learn today and the different group memberships of folks, so they see themselves in the curricula and in the visual images you have. Because data shows it's part of your culture of caring. If a student can see themselves in an administrator, a staff member, a faculty member, and go, they made it, therefore I can. And if all we're showing to students, in this case, if I was teaching, if I'm just talking with, white men are mostly my authors, and the images I'm showing are 95% whites, and my stories are mostly about whites, the folks of color and or folks who come from poverty or low-income working class backgrounds won't see them in my stories, because even as I talked about whites, most of my stories will have a class privilege as well. So that would be what I would do with faculty, is help them see what they're doing, what's working, and what else is possible, and what could be the outcomes if we really shifted our practice.
So that's a lot to consider. People have asked me, I was in the classroom for 25 years, and before I moved into administration, I've had the great fortune of serving as president here at Green River. And people have asked me most every term, do you miss being in the classroom? And the answer is yes. On one hand, I don't miss grading. I don't miss grading exams and papers and so on. But I have found ways to, have interactions with the students on campus, which sort of feeds me in a selfish way, right? Feeds me in terms of being able to hear from the students. But I'm struck by how diverse our student population is, far more than it was when all the years that I taught. And I know if I were an instructor contemporarily, there would be a lot of learning that I would have to be engaged in right now to to keep my classroom being in a space that all students had an equal opportunity to succeed, which would mean a lot of different ways of thinking about content than, quite honestly, I didn't have to think about, um, back in the late 80s, early 90s, based on the institution I was at. Um, and it's a challenging, multidimensional um, role that faculty have. It's not just being the content experts. It's also exploring the different pedagogy or approaches to how one can share the knowledge that they have to make it equally accessible to all their learners. So one of the things that is of such great value, that I'm grateful for every day here, is our faculty who have chosen to be focused on teaching and instruction and committed to community colleges. So I'm hoping that some of the suggestions that you're offering up are helpful to some. And you mentioned the identity cards, and for our listeners, and this would be also true for the students here who are listening. We're going to post the identity cards on our website, which is the Gatorcast website, and you'll get information at the end of the podcast and the beginning of the podcast in terms of where you can find us on our website. But we'll have a link to the identity cards, and we'll also have a link to Dr. Kathy Obear's website, which has a variety of different resources for all listeners here, whether you're a student, an employee, a community member listening in our service area outside of the state, whatever it might be. You might find some very helpful resources in terms of furthering your understanding of and your work, your own personal work on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So check that out on our website. That'll be linked with this podcast episode. So let's go back then to one other group, which would be the staff, right? A lot of our staff are front-facing to students. They're not in the instructional role, but they play they serve and play a vital role and part of the student experience here on campus. Are there additional messages or thoughts or recommendations you have for them in terms of working with their colleagues and working with our students?
So you reminded me how my mom was the secretary to a principal of a high school. And I believe she knew most of the students, some of the family members, and all of the teachers and staff. And so when a dynamic happened, literally the principal would say, "June, come talk to me. What should I do?" And he used her as a partner, a thought partner. What I want to say to staff is you have so much insight into who our students are. Does your department utilize you as a thought partner? Because often classism plays in where I was working with one client system that was very committed to equity inclusion, and the administrative staff, secretary type roles were not included in the meetings and the trainings. The staff meeting, they weren't there. And I'm just like, how can you have a true staff if you're not utilizing the wisdom and input? And so the first step might be to have the staff think about whose voices get heard, who gets to be at the table. And as staff, amongst staff, are we being inclusive? And with faculty, so a faculty department, how are the staff being utilized as thought partners and colleagues? Because here's what I know. The staff in a faculty department see and interact with far more students than most faculty ever do. And they have a pulse on what are some of the issues, because students will be talking in the hallway and the staff will overhear. And so how can we have our administrative, as in deans, chairs, realize how valuable different staff are, and are we really giving access so that we partner and think things through? So that was kind of a pep talk to staff to realize how brilliant you all are and how much wisdom and insights you have that is underutilized. You talked about a community of care. I get to campuses and sometimes hear from students that the one person they know they can talk to is the custodian that they see operating around, and they talk to them. And so I like to have people in service roles, whether it's custodian, administrative assistants, food service, police, campus officer, whatever the role is that is not necessarily thought of. It may be the registrar that you come in and the first person you see as you're trying to pay a bill. Or so how can they realize that that interaction could make or break the difference in that student that day deciding to stay at Green River or to leave? So many of our students have so many demands, pressures, and difficult barriers and obstacles in their life outside of college. And staff can sometimes be the one person who can make a difference in helping someone decide to stay. And the other role of staff that's so critical, and I don't mean just student services, folks that are in advising or career. I'm talking about every staff member in accounting, anybody that's student facing and interacting. How can we make sure they know all the different resources on campus? Because the student who is thinking about suicide may not say it, but as a staff member, you might pick up on something. And so if they're feeling a certain way, you might say, you know what? I have a daughter that just started going to the counseling center. I don't know if you've ever thought of it, but I've done it. Now, that might be an extreme example, but the idea of what are the resources for student success, whether it's the food bank, ways to get loans for different things, transportation strategies, counseling, academic advising. What are all the different things? And because I'm not sure all staff, I think at a certain level, quote, and above, but are we really utilizing the ability of all staff to have resources and information that they can be supporting student success from their position in the campus? And I don't know.
It's such a good point that you bring up, and I know that Green River, we've made a concerted effort to creating consolidated resource materials, not just to have accessible by the student, but to provide to all employees at the institution, recognizing exactly what you just shared, which is a student can come into contact with anyone on this campus, and it might be that interaction that either makes their day or not. And down to, we have custodians. Yep. We have grounds crew. They're out there working, cleaning up, making our campus and maintaining our campus on a beautiful level. We have a beautiful campus. And they're very observant, and they recognize when students are having difficult days, and they do a wonderful job of providing information to those students. And I think any institution that works hard at getting the resources to every employee, no matter who they are, no matter what their role is, the more caring and inclusive it will be in terms of getting those students to the resources. So oftentimes our challenge isn't that we don't have the resource. We have the resource. It's whether or not the student knows it or that we know it, so we can get the student connected to it. So it's a really important point that you bring up. No matter who an employee is, no matter what group their identity is to, whether staff, faculty, exempt, classified staff, and these are the categories that we have within our organizational culture. We are equally likely to be a support for a student, given the fact that we're on this campus. We can run into students at any point in time. And for the students, what message might you have to them in the context of diversity, equity, and inclusion?
And it's one I was going to go back to staff on, but this message goes for staff, faculty, leaders. I'll focus it on students, is that having an inclusive campus where people can succeed based on their own merit without artificial barriers is all of our responsibility. And as students, we are committed to accelerating your success, and you have a role as well in paying attention to classroom dynamics, the dynamics in the different areas that you might be sitting, studying in the library, walking across campus, getting something to eat. And when you see a microaggression, somebody saying or do something that has someone feel dismissed, disrespected, you have a responsibility to speak up. And so providing tools in classrooms as well as other trainings for students to get the skills, staff, faculty as well. How do we recognize the uninclusive, subtle daily dynamics that happen, and your role as a student to be a part of this community as we're also challenging everyone else who's a member of this community? A. B, my message is the work world has been changing for a long time, and for students to find meaningful, life-giving work where you feel of service and are making the kind of income that will support you and other people in your life, that there's a whole set of skills that have been overlooked by most higher ed. And those skills of working effectively on diverse teams, understanding dynamics of inclusion and exclusion, being able to interrupt interpersonal microaggressions, as well as policies and systems and how to create them from the beginning that are more inclusive and how to change them when you're in them and you find that some people get more support and needs met than others. So these are critical skills. And in addition to that, I was just doing some research for another webinar I'm doing, and emotional intelligence, or EQ, has gotten a lot of more attention, especially in corporations the last couple decades. I talk about it as in navigating difficult situations when you're triggered, you have a hot button, but that core skill set of how to pay attention in the moment when you've been reactivated in some emotions, and how do you navigate yourself so you can still show up and be useful? Because for some folks, particularly with multiple marginalized identities, often a person or a system will only allow you one mistake, if that, before they decide you're not fit. And that's how oppression works, whereas someone like me can make 10, 20, 30 missteps. And so having people realize that these skills and capacities are on top of or integrated with the content you're learning. The third thing I would say is, if you're more like me and you actually grew up with some class privilege, middle class or above, and you identify as white, that, and I could keep going, able-bodied, that how can you learn about what are the daily dynamics, interpersonal as well as the culture and systems dynamic, that actually create barriers for folks in the corresponding marginal identity? Because a disbelief or a myth I often hear whites say, particularly young white men, is the system is stacked against me. I can't get a job anymore. And the truth is, if you look at the data, white men are still getting hired everywhere, as well as state legislatures, Congress, Senate. So the myth of reverse discrimination and all that is put out there, I think, to undermine our commitment to equity and inclusion. But the data shows people in privileged identities are still getting hired. But here's what I want to say to parents and family, as well as the students. If you have any thought that the deck is stacked against you, actually, your ticket to the future is learning these tools and skills about creating inclusion, interrupting oppression, and creating true respect policies and practices that serve everyone. If you can have those capacities in your privileged identities, organizations will see that you are different from most people in your different same groups. So if you're a young white man, a 42-year-old white man, and you can talk about equity and racial justice and really demonstrate how you do that, you will be hired far faster than other people in those same white male groups. And I could say the same for everybody. So those are the messages to students. These are current career skills we need today, and we will need more and more in the future as our nation and the world continues to shift in demographics and the commitment to true equity.
It's a powerful message, and I think probably one that applies not just to the students, but for all of us who work, whether it's higher ed or any other organization, any of us who have multiple years ahead in terms of working. Important takeaways from what you just said. So let's just shift a little bit. We've been talking a lot about institutions and what we can do in our various roles. And turn it back to you. You've been doing equity work now for 32, 33 years. How has this work changed? How has it stayed the same? Um, what are the greatest challenges, frustrations? What's remained the same in this work?
I think what's remained the same is the need for us to, I call it wear trifocals, because I've literally worn them probably 20 years. There's 3 different lenses we have to do this work. We have to help individual people greater self-awareness, more skills, motivation, and accountability to be a part of co-creating inclusive organizations. But in order to do that, we have to help everybody understand that by group membership, we have differential life experiences. And that somebody who's a new immigrant to the U.S. is going to have a very different life experience, even if they're from Germany, where my heritage, Germany and France. If they're white and from Germany, they're going to have a different life experience in this country, in this current context, than I do as a U.S.-born citizen. And I could go down all the different diversity categories and do the same. So helping everyone understand multiple differences and what's the daily dynamics and how's the climate and culture and system set up for some and not as much for others. All that has been the same. And then how do you, at the organizational level, so that's the third. You got individual group. How does our impact and privileged marginalized group impact how we can access fairly? And then systems, understanding systems. What has changed is more and more people are beginning to agree that it's the systems and the practices that need to change, the culture and the climate. In addition to interpersonal dynamics, that's critical, but we have to get everyone aware, empowered, and responsible for co-creating inclusive systems, and not just leave it to a few people, whether it's a equity inclusion vice president or the president. It's got to be everybody's job. More organizations are saying it, and more organizations, I believe, are taking the steps to move to get people the skills and the accountability structures and performance appraisals in supervision, so that more and more folks see it's their role and they'll be held accountable to continue to deepen competencies and to make a difference in everything they do towards equity inclusion.
And what inspires you the most about this work?
I still have hope. If you'd asked me yesterday after I read Facebook and listened to the news here in the U.S., I go in and out of despair and hope. Today I have hope. I've been talking to a lot of people and doing several live calls like this where I realize how many, literally millions of people in this country and probably hundreds of millions around the world are committed to intentional equity, inclusion, and social justice. I'm not alone. I have a role to play. I have some talents to give, but there are so many folks I can continue to learn with and work with and leave my footprint, my legacy here. So what inspires me is when I personally see that how I've shown up in the work. I had a white person write me just a couple weeks ago to say, your work with other whites and your work about raising our awareness and dismantling racism has inspired me as a white person to do more. That gives me hope and inspires me. I've had several folk of color say, working with you has shown me what's possible for whites, and the healing spaces you've co-created with other folk of color have really helped us heal some of that internalized racism and empowered ourselves to be true leaders in this organization. So when I see small steps or big steps, it gives me hope. When I see organizational leadership teams really change their climate and how they engage each other and how they try to have an equity lens in everything they do, and they tell me stories about what's changing, that gives me hope. But I have to be honest, there is so much more work to be done. I thought we were making huge progress, and one could argue there have been incremental pieces of progress, but especially in these last 3 years, I have seen so much reverting or going back to old. And I've seen the resurgence of white supremacist, anti-Semitic, misogynist, anti-woman, transphobic, I could keep going, anti-queer, blaming the poor, criminalizing poverty. I could just keep going. There's been the voices of those who I want to be different have gotten centered in so many ways and in mainstreamed. So how do we do this work? And it's not a political issue in my mind, Democrat, Republican. Actually, there's people on all sides of political spectrums that have racist attitudes, practices, classist attitudes. But how do we come together to really say, what are we about? Where do we need to go? How close are we? And how can we pool our brilliance in our campus as well as other places can we learn from, truly live up to the core values and mission of this organization, this community college? That's what gives me hope when organizations are committed to systemic long-term culture change and truly empowering and amplifying the talents of everyone, getting rid of oppression. That's what motivates me every day. But there are days it's hard to get out of bed.
So, in closing, if and when you retire, and I'm not sure whether retirement is on your things to do in life, what would you look back to? What metrics or measures would you look at to gauge whether you would view your career as having been successful?
And I know people are different, but for me, being of service and making change is what I use. And so looking back and have people change their lives, have systems changed because in part of what I've been able to do in person, virtually, as well as the resources that I share and the handouts people can use and the books that people can get for free. And so has my living on this earth left a legacy of tools and strategies and approaches and healing that others have picked up, not to necessarily do it just like I did. In fact, I want them to do it better. Build on what I've done, because I've built my stuff on many people's work. And are people really doing the racial justice work, the dismantling of white supremacy? Those particularly are my passions these days. And the Social Justice Training Institute I've worked with some colleagues for over 20 years now. We've had several thousand people go through a very intense workshop that we do in Institute. And I know I was a part of, wasn't all about me, but I was a part of thousands of folks, much different on their campuses and in their organizations, creating greater inclusion and racial justice because of the work we did at the Social Justice Training Institute and some of the follow-up work that people have accessed for my personal work. So I'm prolific. And people can find at least 2 of my books free on my website, and lots of handouts and lots of blogs and lots of free videos. And my hope is people will take the library that I'm leaving and add to it, because it's about individual and systems change. I've seen it happen, and I just hope my work has been one of many to contribute to truly creating equity, inclusion, social justice, racial justice, moving the needle day by day.
Thank you so much, Kathy. And as a reminder to our listeners, we will have links and resources on our website connected to this podcast. You've been listening to Gatorcast, Green River College's official podcast. Green River College, Auburn, Washington. Thank you so much. And thank you so much again, Kathy Obear, for your conversation today. And thank you, listeners. We'll talk to you soon.